When Shadow stopped in the woods, Alyssa thought it was nothing. But what he found tore open a secret the town had hidden for 15 years. The air was crisp, the kind that hinted at fall, even though the leaves hadn't fully turned. Birds chirped lazily from the treetops, and a squirrel darted across the trail. But neither sound stirred the jet-black dog walking ahead of Deputy Alyssa Hart. Shadow moved with quiet precision, nose low, ears twitching, every step calculated. Alyssa followed a few paces behind, her boots crunching over the worn path that wrapped around the back of Millfield High School and sloped gently into the woods. They were supposed to be on a routine patrol. Nothing out of the ordinary, just checking for signs of trespassing or the usual beer cans and cigarette butts that teenagers left behind. Shadow suddenly stopped. It wasn't a hesitation or a momentary pause like he'd caught a squirrel's scent. He froze, mid-step, muscles locked, head tilted. Alyssa felt the leash go tight between them. She looked up, squinting through the trees, but saw nothing except the quiet woods and sunlight dripping through the branches. "Shadow," she called softly, giving the leash a gentle tug. He didn't move. Instead, his ears flattened and a low growl rumbled from his throat, quiet and deep. His hackles rose, a black ridge along his spine. Slowly, he began to edge sideways, moving in a careful arc, eyes locked on something just beyond a cluster of thorn bushes near the rusted fence line. Alyssa followed his gaze, her eyes landing on an old suitcase. It sat half sunken into the dirt, covered in moss and dead leaves, its corners softened by time and weather. The zipper was rusted shut. A broken handle dangled from one side. The sight of it made her stomach twist, though she couldn't say why. Shadow let out a whine then, low and high-pitched, the kind he used when he found something he didn't understand, but couldn't ignore. He circled the suitcase once, nose to the ground, then again, slower this time. His body was tense, legs stiff, tail low. He stopped in front of it and sat down hard, chest rising and falling with quick breaths. Alyssa's pulse kicked up. She stepped forward cautiously, her hand resting on the grip of her sidearm. Shadow didn't bark, but his eyes tracked her every move. It wasn't fear in his expression. It was something closer to sadness, maybe even recognition. "What is it, boy?" she whispered. Shadow pressed his nose to the suitcase and let out another whine, softer this time, almost like a cry. Alyssa crouched beside him, brushing away leaves with her gloved hand. The suitcase looked like it hadn't been touched in years. There was a small crack in the fabric, where a bit of faded pink showed through, like the corner of a child's blanket, or maybe a stuffed animal. A chill crept up her spine. She pulled out her radio, eyes still on Shadow. He wasn't moving. His breathing had slowed, but his posture hadn't relaxed. He was waiting, watching. "This is Unit 4, she said, her voice calm but firm. "I need backup at the rear woods behind Millfield High. Possible evidence found." Shadow didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the suitcase, his body a statue of loyalty and warning. Something was in there. Something old. Something wrong. And Shadow had felt it before anyone else. The woods were quiet again. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that comes just before a buried secret is forced into the light. The suitcase sat alone under the trees, still covered in moss and dirt, like it had been waiting for someone to find it. Yellow tape circled the area now, fluttering in the light breeze. Officers stood nearby in quiet clusters, talking in low voices, their eyes drawn again and again to the suitcase and to Shadow, who still hadn't moved. He sat close to the find, ears twitching, his gaze sharp and steady. Alyssa stayed beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. He was tense but calm, like he understood what was coming. The bomb squad arrived within the hour. A small truck pulled up with blinking lights, and 2 technicians stepped out, dressed in protective suits and carrying careful, steady hands. One of them nodded to Alyssa before kneeling near the suitcase. They used small brushes to clear the remaining dirt away, checking for wires, checking for traps. Standard procedure. Most people expected it to be a false alarm. Maybe a stash of drugs, maybe something dumped by teenagers years ago. But no one spoke with any real confidence. Alyssa watched closely, her fingers twitching against Shadow's fur. The dog hadn't taken his eyes off the suitcase, not once. His head tilted as the technician carefully clicked open the rusted latches. The suitcase groaned in protest. A cloud of musty air escaped, heavy and foul. The first thing they saw was a moldy, stuffed bear. Its fur was matted and green in places, as if it had soaked up years of rain and rot. One black button eye stared blankly upward. Alyssa took a small step forward. Her breath caught in her throat. The technician gently lifted the bear out and set it aside. Then he froze. Everyone around the tape line stopped talking. Inside the suitcase, beneath the bear, was the small, skeletal body of a child. Bones yellowed with time, fragile, and curled in on themselves, like the child had been trying to hide. A faded dress clung to what remained, the fabric torn and stained, barely holding together. Alyssa couldn't move. The technician's gloved hand reached in and gently lifted the tiny arm. Something hung from the wrist. A small bracelet, once pink but now nearly colorless, with plastic beads shaped like hearts. The name was still clear, spelled out in block letters. L-I-L-A. For a moment, the wind died, and the woods felt completely still. Alyssa's voice was barely a whisper. Lila Monroe. One of the older officers nodded, his face pale. 15 years ago, she went missing walking home from school. They never found her. Shadow let out a soft whine, his ears pinned back. Alyssa felt her heart clench. She remembered the posters, the candlelight vigils, the school bulletin board covered in messages. Lila's disappearance had shaken the town back then, left a hole that never really closed. Some people had moved on, others had moved away, and now here she was, hidden in the dirt all this time, just yards from the high school. Someone cleared their throat, breaking the silence. Get the coroner. Notify her family, if they're still local. They left, Alyssa murmured. After the 3rd year. Said they couldn't breathe here anymore. She knelt down beside Shadow, rubbing his neck slowly, her eyes never leaving the suitcase. You brought her home, she said quietly. The dog didn't move, but his breathing slowed, as if he understood. Alyssa stood, her jaw tight. The town had buried the memory of Lila Monroe. But now, with one quiet stop in the woods, Shadow had brought the truth back into the light. The news spread faster than anyone expected. By nightfall, every porch light on Main Street glowed a little dimmer, and the usual small-town chatter was gone, replaced by quiet stares and half-finished sentences. Millfield, a sleepy Appalachian town where people waved at strangers and shared lemonade at county fairs, suddenly felt cold. The kind of cold that doesn't come from the weather, but from the weight of something long buried coming back to the surface. People remembered Lila Monroe. How could they not? She was the shy girl with the wide smile, always wearing a ribbon in her hair and carrying her books tight to her chest. Her parents, John and Marissa, had moved to Millfield to escape the noise of the city and give their daughter a quiet place to grow up. They bought the little blue house on Willow Lane, planted roses in the front yard, and came to every school play and parent-teacher meeting. When Lila vanished, everything changed. The night she disappeared was warm and ordinary. She had stayed late at school for art club, walked the same path she always did, right past the bakery and through the woods shortcut that led to her backyard. But she never made it home. Her backpack was found 2 days later by the edge of a stream, torn and empty. The search lasted for weeks. Volunteers came from neighboring towns. Police dogs scoured the woods. Helicopters flew overhead. Flyers were taped to every post and window. But no trace of Lila was ever found. No footprints, no clothing, nothing. In time, the hope faded. Some whispered that maybe she ran away, that she had a secret life online, or that she was unhappy and no one knew. Others believed something darker, something the town didn't want to admit. But without proof, the case slowly turned cold. After nearly a year, the sheriff at the time closed the case, filing it under presumed runaway. Her parents didn't believe it, not for a second. Marissa spoke at town meetings, begged for more attention, more resources, more time, but no one wanted to hear it anymore. People crossed the street to avoid her. Her husband tried to hold her together, but he was falling apart too. After the third year, they sold their home and left Millfield behind. Some said it was guilt, others said it was grief. But deep down, everyone knew they couldn't stay in a town that had stopped listening. Now, 15 years later, a dog had found what no one else could, and suddenly, those old whispers came back, louder this time. People began to question what they thought they knew. Parents asked if their kids were really safe. Old rumors were pulled from dusty corners of memory. Was it someone local? Did someone lie back then? Had someone in Millfield helped hide the truth? Deputy Alyssa Hart stood outside the station that evening, watching the sunset fade behind the hills. Shadow sat beside her, calm now, but his eyes still sharp. She heard footsteps behind her, and turned to see Sheriff Kane approaching, his face drawn tight. "You stirred up a lot today," he said, not unkindly. "No," Alyssa answered. "Shadow did." The sheriff looked at the horizon and sighed. "People don't like when ghosts come back." Alyssa didn't speak. She didn't need to. The suitcase, the bones, the bracelet, they had already done the talking. And now the town of Millfield, no matter how hard it tried, couldn't look away from the truth it had buried for so long. Shadow lay curled in the corner of the station's canine room, eyes half closed, his chest rising and falling in a slow rhythm. Alyssa sat beside him on the floor, one hand resting gently on his thick fur. Outside, the town buzzed with the weight of the news, but inside this quiet room, it was just the two of them. She studied him closely, not as a handler looking at her partner, but as someone trying to understand a deeper truth. He wasn't like other police dogs. Most dogs were trained young, shaped and molded for the job. But Shadow came with a history that few in the department ever asked about. He had scars under his coat, deep ones, the kind that told stories no report ever could. He had moments when loud sounds made him freeze, when his eyes would flick toward the exits like he was preparing for something worse. Alyssa had always respected that about him, his alertness, his focus, but she had never really asked where it came from. Now, with Lila's name back in the air, and the whole town waking up to a forgotten past, Alyssa opened his personnel file again. She flipped through the standard sheets, training evaluations, transfer forms, medical records. But near the bottom, a different set of papers caught her eye. They weren't from Millfield PD. They were older, faded from time and travel. Logos from private contractors, deployment orders, a commendation for bravery in a collapsed school in Syria. Shadow had once pulled 3 children from the rubble there, refusing to stop even when the dust made it hard to breathe. She kept reading. Before he was a police canine, Shadow belonged to a man named Ethan Cole, a retired firefighter turned search and rescue trainer who lived right here in Millfield in a small cabin on the edge of town. According to the paperwork, Ethan had registered Shadow as a SAR dog when he was barely 2 years old. They had worked together for 5 years, responding to disasters across the country, sometimes even overseas. Then suddenly, the file ended. No discharge form, no transfer details, just a quiet gap. And the year it ended matched the same year Lila disappeared. Alyssa's chest tightened. She searched for more, digging through old digital records. She found a faded photo in an archived newspaper article. It showed a younger Ethan standing in front of a classroom at Millfield Elementary, giving a talk about safety. Beside him sat a lean, black dog with a white patch on his chest. Even grainy and blurred, Alyssa recognized him. It was Shadow. He'd been here all along, part of this place, part of that time. And yet no one had said a word. Alyssa leaned back against the wall, heart pounding with questions. What had Shadow seen back then? What had he smelled? Had he tried to warn someone, just like he had with the suitcase? Was he silenced, ignored, forgotten like the girl they'd failed to find? Shadow stirred beside her, lifting his head and meeting her eyes. There was something there, something unspoken but loud enough to feel. He hadn't forgotten. Whatever happened back then, it had left a mark deeper than any scar. And now, all these years later, with new eyes and a second chance, he was picking up the trail again. Only this time, someone was finally listening. The nights felt heavier after the suitcase was found. The kind of heaviness that clings to your skin and keeps your thoughts sharp long after the world goes quiet. Alyssa noticed the change in Shadow right away. At first, she thought he was just tired, maybe unsettled by the events in the woods. But it wasn't that. It was something else. Something deeper. Shadow wasn't sleeping through the night. He paced near the door, sat by the windows, ears flicking at every sound. When she called his name, he would glance back, not confused, just focused on something far away. On patrol, he pulled harder than usual, his nose glued to the ground, but it wasn't the normal kind of tracking. It was frantic, wide sweeps, like he was chasing a memory rather than a scent. He ignored the main trails, choosing instead to dart through underbrush and squeeze through broken fences that hadn't been touched in years. More than once, Alyssa had to jog to keep up, branches slapping her arms as they crashed through the forgotten edges of Millfield. He led her places she didn't recognize. An old barn covered in ivy, a trailhead long erased from town maps, a creek bed dry from drought, but lined with footprints too small to belong to any deer. Shadow would stop, sniff, and let out a low whine, like he was remembering something he couldn't explain. Alyssa watched him closely. It wasn't just instinct driving him, it was memory. She could see it in his eyes. Back at the station, she dug deeper into his file. Not the clean new records they kept on paper, but the old digital logs from when he was still registered with the National Search and Rescue Registry. She scrolled through pages of deployments and reports, many redacted or filled with numbers instead of names. But one name kept showing up in the early entries: Ethan Cole. Alyssa paused. She typed his name into the state registry and got a hit. Former firefighter, certified canine handler, once lived in Millfield. No criminal record, no forwarding address. Last known employer was a private rescue group out of Nashville. But what caught her attention wasn't his resume. It was the note attached to one of the older files. Subject: Cole withdrew from operations following family tragedy. Niece presumed dead. That was it. No mention of Lila's name. No follow-up. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Lila Monroe had been Ethan Cole's niece. That detail had been left out of every report, every town article, every police log she'd read. It wasn't public record, not even whispered among the officers. And Shadow, the dog trained by Ethan, had been part of that original search. Alyssa leaned back in her chair, her thoughts spinning. Shadow had walked these woods before. He'd chased that scent, felt the panic in the air, watched the search fall apart. He'd known Lila. She was family to his handler. And now, years later, the dog was chasing what others had tried to forget. She looked at Shadow, who was lying by the door, eyes wide open, head lifted like he was waiting for her to move. There was no question in his gaze, no hesitation, only one message: he wanted to go back out. And this time, Alyssa would follow him wherever he led. The air was thick with damp leaves and the smell of pine as Alyssa followed Shadow deeper into the woods than they had ever gone before. The ground was soft, uneven, covered in layers of deadfall that muffled their steps. Shadow moved with purpose, his head low, tail stiff, weaving through brush and fallen branches like he had traveled this path 100 times. But there was no real path, not anymore. Whatever trail might have once existed was long gone, erased by years of storms and silence. Alyssa's uniform caught on brambles, and barbed wire stretched between rusted posts. She ducked under the line, her breath fogging in the cool morning air. Shadow didn't wait. He pushed ahead, his pace quickening, as they passed old tree stands and the skeleton of a deer blind that had collapsed in on itself. Birds scattered above them, and somewhere in the distance, a crow called out sharply, as if warning them not to continue. But Shadow didn't stop. Just beyond a ridge, hidden by thick undergrowth, they found it. A small cabin, weather-beaten and forgotten, crouched like a secret in the middle of the forest. The roof had sagged in the center, and one side leaned against a crooked tree like it was trying to hold itself up. Ivy climbed the walls, and broken shutters flapped gently in the breeze. Shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, his ears forward, his body tense. Alyssa stepped beside him, hand on her radio, though she didn't press the button. Something about the cabin made her stomach twist. It wasn't just the way it looked, but the way the woods fell silent around it. No birds, no bugs, just quiet. They approached slowly. The front door hung open, its hinges rusted and squeaking in protest. Inside, the air was damp and still. Dust floated in the narrow beams of light cutting through broken slats. The walls were covered in old graffiti, names and dates scratched deep into the wood. In one corner, there were claw marks, long and deep, like an animal had tried to escape. Chains bolted to the wall still hung from iron rings, their ends rusted and broken. Alyssa's skin prickled. This wasn't just an old hunting cabin. Shadow moved across the floor, nose to the ground, pausing near a warped section of floorboards. He sniffed, then scratched once, twice. Alyssa knelt beside him and pulled back the rotting wood. Beneath it, wrapped in a torn flannel shirt, was a metal lockbox. The hinges were stiff but not locked. She forced it open. Inside were three things: a stack of burned photographs, edges curled and blackened, but some still showing half-smiling faces. A set of dusty VHS tapes, each marked with dates and a single word: watch. And at the bottom, wrapped in clear plastic, a small notebook with the name Leela, written in careful blue pen across the front. Alyssa stared at it, her hands trembling. Shadow sat beside her, watching her quietly, as if he already knew what it meant. They had found the place where the past had been buried, and now, piece by piece, it was coming back. The notebook felt small in Alyssa's hands, its pages worn at the edges, the cover soft from years of handling. The name Lila was written across the front in careful letters, a bit faded now, but still clear. Alyssa sat on the floor of the forgotten cabin, knees drawn up, Shadow resting quietly beside her. The air was thick with old dust, and something colder, something that made the room feel too still. She opened the diary, bracing herself. The first few pages were normal, the kind of things any young girl might write. Notes about school, her favorite teachers, silly crushes. She talked about her parents, how her mom always packed her favorite snacks, how her dad made her laugh, even when he was tired. There were drawings, too, small doodles of flowers, of her house, of a black dog with pointed ears that looked an awful lot like Shadow. But then the tone changed. It started with a line written in smaller letters: "I think someone's watching me." The next few entries were scattered, harder to read. Lila described being in the woods behind her house and hearing footsteps when no one was there. She thought at first it was a deer or maybe a neighbor's dog, but then she saw a man. He stood between the trees, half hidden in the shadows, always watching. He never spoke, just stared. She called him the Shadow Man, a name that made Alyssa pause. Shadow tilted his head at the sound of it, his ears twitching. "The Shadow Man is back," Lila had written days later. "I saw him again near the creek. He waved at me this time." She didn't tell her parents. She was scared they wouldn't believe her. She wrote that she told her uncle instead, Ethan. He had told her not to worry, that the woods were full of strange things, but nothing to be afraid of. Still, she felt uneasy. One page was just a drawing. A tall man, almost like a stick figure, standing in the trees with hollow circles for eyes. In the corner, she had drawn herself, small and curled up behind a bush. Then the entries became shorter, more panicked. I had a nightmare last night. The shadow man came to my window. I think it was real. Uncle Ethan says, I'm imagining things, but I know what I saw. He was in our yard. Then, nothing. The writing stopped 3 days before she disappeared. The last entry was barely a sentence. He was in the hallway. Alyssa closed the diary and wiped her eyes, trying to push down the tightness in her chest. She looked down at the tapes inside the lockbox. Most were marked with dates, but one stood out. It had no title, just the date burned into the label. The day Lila vanished. She turned it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it. The town had spent years wondering what happened that night. So many people convinced themselves she had run away, that the mystery would never be solved. But this tape, this diary, and the dog still lying protectively at her side said otherwise. The truth had never been lost. It had just been buried. The air inside the evidence room felt colder than usual as Alyssa placed the tape into the old VCR the department still kept in the back for outdated cases. The screen flickered, lines running across it before a shaky image filled the monitor. It was grainy, like it had been filmed on a cheap handheld camera. There were trees, lots of them, and the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. Someone was laughing, a child's laugh, soft and bright. Alyssa's stomach clenched. Then a voice spoke, deeper, calm, familiar. Come on, Lila, just a little further. You're doing great. The camera turned, catching a glimpse of her, a girl in a light jacket, hair pulled back with a pink ribbon. Lila. She was smiling, her arms wrapped around something she carried, a teddy bear maybe. She looked happy, trusting. The person filming told her to count to 10 and close her eyes. She did, giggling, covering her face. I'm going to hide, he said. You have to come find me. The screen blurred for a moment as the camera shifted. It didn't hide well. You could still see her behind a tree, trying to follow the voice. But something in the way the man spoke changed. His words were still gentle, but there was no warmth in them anymore, only control. The tape skipped forward. Alyssa didn't know if it was by design or time damage, but when it came back, Lila was crying. You couldn't see her clearly, just the edge of her sleeve and her voice, muffled and scared. The man, Ethan, said her name, over and over, like he was trying to calm her, but the way he said it sent chills down Alyssa's spine. Then the camera cut out. Alyssa sat back, heart pounding, bile rising in her throat. She had seen enough. She pulled the tape from the player and placed it gently back into the case, sealing it in an evidence bag. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She knew where she had to go. She found Sheriff Gaines in his office, staring out the window like he had been waiting for something. She placed the evidence bag on his desk and said, without blinking, "It's Ethan, Lila's uncle." He took her. Gaines didn't look surprised. He didn't even ask what was on the tape. He simply turned away from the window and met her eyes with a tired expression. "I know," he said quietly. The words hit harder than anything she had seen. "You knew?" Alyssa asked, her voice rising. "You knew and you didn't say anything?" Gaines looked old in that moment, not just in years, but in guilt. There was no proof back then, only whispers. He was a war hero, respected. People looked up to him, including me. That little girl trusted him, Alyssa snapped. He was family, and she trusted me too, he said, almost in a whisper. I failed her. We all did. She waited for him to say more, to ask what they needed to do now, but he didn't. Instead, he sighed and picked up the evidence bag. Then he slid it back across the desk toward her. "Drop it," he said. "For your sake. And for Shadow's." Alyssa stared at him, stunned. For a second, she thought she hadn't heard him right. "I'm not dropping anything," she said, her voice cold. She stood, scooped up the tape, and turned to leave. Shadow was waiting for her outside the door, his eyes locked on hers, steady and sure. She felt something shift inside her, something solid. If the law wouldn't fight for Lila, then she would. And she wasn't doing it alone. Not with a dog like Shadow by her side. The next few days were a blur of quiet footsteps and locked doors. Alyssa stopped trusting her fellow officers. She stopped trusting most people, really. It was the way they looked at her now, with caution, with avoidance. Like they knew what she had found, but were hoping she'd forget it. Like they'd rather it all go back to being buried. But she couldn't let it go. In the quiet hours of the night, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by old case files, Shadow sleeping at her feet. The more she read, the clearer it became. Ethan Cole wasn't just a decorated war veteran or a respected former firefighter. He had been connected to everything. His face showed up in dozens of newspaper clippings, shaking hands with politicians at fundraisers, teaching children about safety, standing tall in uniforms that made people feel safe. And there, in a wedding announcement from 20 years ago, was the connection that made her blood run cold. Sheriff Gaines had married Ethan's sister. It explained too much. Why the case had been closed so quickly. Why Shadow, then just a search and rescue dog, had been pulled off the scene after only one day. She found a report, brief and vague, stating that Shadow had become uncooperative during the search. But the notes didn't match what she knew of him now, or the dog she saw in the videos back then. Shadow hadn't been uncooperative. He'd been right. He had followed Lila's trail, and Ethan had stopped him. Alyssa closed the file and rubbed her temples, heart pounding. The town had let this happen. Not just one man. The sheriff, the department, the officials who smiled and shook hands while a girl vanished in their own backyard. And no one said a word. She started making a list. Names. People who had been close to Ethan. Men who'd gone hunting with him. Who sat beside him at charity dinners. Who had power when Lila went missing and didn't use it to help. Some of them were still around, serving on local boards, running businesses, donating to the same causes that once praised Ethan as a hero. The truth was right there, sitting in dusty files and newspaper clippings. Alyssa looked down at Shadow, still asleep, one paw twitching like he was dreaming. Maybe he remembered that time, the fear in the woods, the scent trail he'd tried to follow. Maybe he never stopped remembering. That's why he'd let her back. That's why he stopped at the suitcase. He was trying again. She reached down and placed her hand on his back. His eyes opened slowly, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. No words, just knowing. He had tried to save Lila once. He'd been silenced by a man he trusted. A man who trained him to obey and then used that trust to hide something terrible. But not this time. This time, Alyssa wasn't going to back down, and Shadow wasn't going to let her. The rain came down hard that night, washing over the rooftops and whispering against the windows like a warning. Alyssa stood in her kitchen, staring at the wall clock. It was almost midnight. Shadow lay by the back door, alert but quiet, ears twitching with every distant rumble of thunder. The air felt wrong. She couldn't explain it, but something in her chest had been tight all evening, like her body was bracing for a storm that hadn't yet arrived. She turned off the kitchen light and walked toward the hallway when she heard it. A soft creak, the kind that didn't belong to the wind or the house settling. She froze, heart skipping a beat. Another creak, this one closer. Then the sound of glass. It shattered in the back bedroom. Shadow was already up, a low growl rolling through his chest as he launched down the hallway, muscles tight and moving fast. Alyssa reached for the small pistol in her desk drawer and followed him, staying low, every step echoing in her ears. The bedroom door was ajar, the curtains blown in by the wind. A figure moved in the dark, quick and clumsy, pulling open drawers, rifling through her files. Alyssa didn't hesitate. "Stop!" she shouted, weapon raised. The intruder turned, but not to run. He lunged forward. Shadow hit him first, teeth bared, snarling as he sank his jaws into the man's arm. The fight was messy and fast. The man swung wildly, trying to shake the dog off, knocking over a lamp. The light flickered once and went out. In the struggle, a piece of cloth tore free. Shadow ripped it straight from the man's sleeve. Then the man shoved hard and scrambled through the broken window, vanishing into the storm. Alyssa dropped to her knees beside Shadow, checking him over. He was shaken but unhurt. His teeth still clenched the scrap of fabric. She took it gently from him, her hands shaking. It was part of a dark blue jacket. She recognized the patch sewn just above the seam. Millfield PD. Department issued. Her heart dropped. Someone inside the station had sent that man. Someone she had passed in the hall, maybe even shared coffee with. All this time, she thought she was being careful, that she could fight this quietly. But now she knew. She wasn't safe. And neither was the evidence. She didn't wait. She pulled out the backup copy of the tape she'd made that morning and wrapped it in brown paper, along with Lila's diary. She scribbled a note and sealed it all into a waterproof envelope. Then she grabbed her phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in a long time. "Carla," she whispered when the reporter answered. "I need your help. You trust me? Always. I'm sending you something. Get it to someone who can't be bought." After she hung up, Alyssa packed a small bag. Cash, a burner phone, Shadow's food, and a spare leash. She didn't take much else. There wasn't time. She clipped Shadow's vest in place, gave him a scratch behind the ear, and looked him in the eye. "We can't stay," she said softly. "But we're not running away. We're moving forward." Shadow wagged his tail once. They slipped out the back into the dark, into the storm, and into the unknown. Not because they were afraid, because they had something to finish. The news hit the town of Millfield like a bolt of lightning. By morning, it had spread far beyond the hills and quiet roads. Headlines blared across TV screens and news apps, the kind you couldn't ignore even if you tried. Evidence surfaces in 15-year-old disappearance case. Local police accused of cover-up. The name Lila Monroe was everywhere again. Not as a lost child or a sad memory, but as a symbol of truth finally coming to light. The diary and tapes Alyssa sent to the reporter had done exactly what she hoped. The story was real, the evidence undeniable, and it sparked something bigger than she ever imagined. The FBI stepped in within hours. They didn't waste time. Records were pulled, phone lines tapped, and boxes of files from the Millfield station were seized. What they found inside shocked even the agents who thought they'd seen it all. Missing paperwork, deleted files, and a pattern of silence that ran deeper than anyone guessed. The first arrest was small, a former deputy who admitted to hiding Ethan's name from the original investigation. Then came others. Men who had hunted with Ethan, who had attended meetings, who had stayed quiet when Lila vanished. Sheriff Gaines resigned before he could be removed. His press conference was short, his face pale, his words heavy. "I failed this town," he said, "and I failed that little girl." But no apology could fix what had been broken. Alyssa stayed quiet through it all, watching from the sidelines, hidden with Shadow in a borrowed cabin 3 counties over. She didn't care about credit. She only cared about the end. And the end came when the FBI tracked Ethan Cole to a remote cabin deep in the woods of West Virginia. He had changed his name, grown a beard, lived quiet and alone. He had built a new life on top of the old one, like burying rotten wood under clean paint. But you can't bury guilt. Not forever. When the agents surrounded the cabin, they didn't knock. They let Shadow lead the way. He moved like he already knew the place. Like some part of him remembered the smell, the trees, the feel of that old rot in the air. His ears were high, his steps quick but careful. He stopped right at the front door, nose twitching. Ethan opened it before anyone could speak. Maybe he heard them coming. Maybe he knew this day would find him eventually. His eyes met Shadow's, and everything else vanished. The dog didn't bark. He didn't wait. He launched forward with a force that came from years of betrayal and memory. Ethan went down hard, pinned flat on the porch. Shadow's teeth clenched around his arm just enough to hold him, not enough to tear. Agents rushed in, shouting commands. weapons raised, but they didn't fire. They didn't need to. The truth had already landed. Alyssa stepped out of the trees then, her face calm, steady. "He didn't forget," she said. "And neither did I." Ethan looked up at her, blood on his lip, fear in his eyes. And for the first time in 15 years, there were no more lies left to tell. The sun was gentle that morning, soft rays slipping through the trees as the town of Millfield gathered in the clearing, once hidden by silence. What had once been overgrown woods was now open space, trimmed and cleaned, with flower beds planted by the community, and a wide stone path leading to a tall wooden sign that read, "Shadow Park." Beneath it was a bronze plaque, simple but powerful, in memory of Lila Monroe, in honor of the dog who never stopped searching. Alyssa stood off to the side, her uniform crisp, her badge polished, though she had no interest in attention. Next to her, Shadow sat tall and proud, his black coat glossy in the morning light. He wore a new vest, custom-made, with clean white letters sewn across the side. "I never forgot." People came in small groups, many carrying wildflowers or photos. Lila's parents had returned, older now, quieter, but grateful. Marissa Monroe wiped her eyes as she placed a pink ribbon on the base of the plaque, the same kind Lila used to wear in her hair. Her husband stood beside her, one arm wrapped around her shoulders, the other clutching a framed picture of their daughter, smiling and alive in the way they wanted the world to remember her. There was no big speech, just a few words from the mayor, and a short reading by one of Lila's old classmates, who now had children of her own. No one needed to say much. The truth had already been spoken, the lies stripped away. What mattered now was that the town remembered not just the crime, but the silence that followed it, and the dog who refused to let that silence win. Alyssa looked down at Shadow. He was older now, slower in the mornings, his walks shorter, his naps longer. But in his eyes, there was still that same fire, that same steady focus. He hadn't changed much, not where it counted. He'd done more than any badge or title ever could. When the ceremony ended, people lined up to shake her hand. Some of them she didn't recognize. Others she did. Former classmates, old officers, neighbors who once looked the other way. Now they looked at her with something different. Respect, maybe? Gratitude? One little girl knelt in front of Shadow and ran her fingers gently through his fur. "You're a good dog," she said. Shadow leaned his head forward and let her hug him, his eyes half closed, calm. Later that week, Alyssa was offered a promotion, a desk job at the state level, more pay, a cleaner uniform. She turned it down without hesitation. She didn't need a new title. She already had what mattered: truth, justice, and the partner who helped her find it. Shadow spent his days watching the park now, resting under the shade of the trees, his vest hanging nearby, a symbol of everything he had given. People brought him treats, kids asked to take photos with him, and every once in a while, he would bark softly when someone passed who still carried secrets. Because Shadow didn't just serve, he remembered. And now, so did Millfield. Thank you for watching this video of a dog's devotion. If you liked this story, show your support with a like. And join us by subscribing for more inspiring stories like this one.